Hi everybody, today I want to talk about two terms that get thrown around in the media a lot, namely the terms terrorists and rebels. The reason I want to talk about this is because these are two terms that get labeled on different groups. If you notice, some groups get called terrorists and other groups get called rebels. Now why is this? Well, usually it's because one group is serving US interests and they are called the rebels, and another group is opposing US interests, at least to some extent or fully, and they are called terrorists. Now you can see this, for example, with the Syrian war. The US establishment was so keen on having Assad overthrown that they, together with their allies, poured arms and into the whole conflict, and they trained terrorists, and then they were called rebels. Now the very same rebels, for example al-Nusra, when they went over to ISIS and suddenly ISIS became a problem, maybe ISIS was threatening oil fields and so on, and ISIS maybe was at risk of maybe running over Iraq. They saw perhaps that coming, and suddenly they're terrorists. Well, it was the same. Many of them were the same people from al-Nusra and all Al-Qaeda groups. When they went over to when they went over to ISIS, then they became terrorists. So what's the difference? They were terrorists too, al-Nusra, and all those groups over there are terrorists also. But the difference was now they were, at least to some extent, opposing US policy. So now they became terrorists. For example, another example I'll give you is this. Have you ever heard the term Taliban rebel? Ever? I haven't. Why is that? That's because Talibans oppose US foreign policy. They oppose the occupation of Afghanistan. That's why. But if you go back to the 80s, when they were called Mujahideens and Mujahideen fighters, which is where the Taliban basically came from, then they were not called terrorists. Then they were called Mujahideen or Mujahideen fighters, because then they were serving US interests. For example, they were fighting the Soviets, right, in Afghanistan, in the first Afghanistan war. So what's the difference? The difference was at that time they were serving US interests. They were the type of terrorists that the US likes, rebels. And now the Taliban are the type of terrorists that the US doesn't like. Then they're called terrorists or insurgents. So when you look at the media and you hear these terms thrown around, keep an eye out for these things. You'll notice that some groups are going to be labeled terrorists and others are going to be labeled rebels. So anyway, that's what I got to say about that. Thanks for watching.